Imagine being in the room with someone who has spent their entire life hating you. Every word they've spoken, every action they've taken has been laced with prejudice. Now, picture this person, vulnerable, dying, and in need of help. What would you do? Would you step forward? Would you extend a hand? Or would you turn away, unable to let go of the past? In today's story, we're diving deep into a powerful tale of humanity, sacrifice, and the transformative power of forgiveness. This is the story of Emily. The black nurse Emily had always been dedicated to her work. From the moment she started nursing, she knew she was called to serve. Her patients were her priority, and no amount of bigotry or hate would sway her from that path. But Emily's journey was far from easy, especially when she was faced with a patient named Mr. Thomas, an elderly man who had spent his life spewing hatred toward anyone who wasn't like him. His past wasn't hidden. His views were well known in the town. Mr. Thomas had built a reputation for being a bitter, racist man. His family had long distanced themselves from him, but when he ended up in the hospital with a severe condition, it was Emily who was assigned to his care. Can you imagine being the one person who has to care for someone who doesn't even see you as human? Emily's first day on the job was filled with tension, a feeling she could sense every time she entered Mr. Thomas's room. Before we dive deeper into this story, let me ask you, have you ever been in a situation where you had to show kindness to someone who hurt you? How did you handle it? From the start, Mr. Thomas refused Emily's help. Every time she tried to assist him with his medications or check his vitals, he'd grunt and turn his face away. "I don't need a woman like you touching me," he'd sneer, his voice thick with disdain. The air was thick with anger, and Emily could feel her patience wearing thin. But Emily was no stranger to prejudice. She had grown up in a world that often overlooked her and dismissed her worth. She'd been called names, judged for the color of her skin, and belittled for her dreams. But Emily was determined not to let that define her. Her commitment to her work and the oath she had taken as a nurse was stronger than any hateful words. As the days passed, Emily continued to show up, despite Mr. Thomas's hostility. He would shout, curse, and make rude remarks, yet Emily remained calm. She knew that anger was just fear in disguise. She had a gift for seeing past the surface, for recognizing the pain behind the words. One evening, as Emily entered the room, she found Mr. Thomas in tears. His breathing was labored, his face pale and strained. This wasn't the angry, racist man who had cursed at her only days before. This was a vulnerable human being, confronting his own mortality. The man who had spent a lifetime rejecting kindness now needed it more than ever. But what happens when a person who's lived their life with hate suddenly faces the reality of their end? Will Mr. Thomas finally see Emily for who she truly is? Or will his prejudices remain until the last breath? The next few days were different. Mr. Thomas, in his fragile state, began to let go of his anger. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. But Emily noticed the change. He'd no longer shout at her, though he still muttered insults under his breath. His physical decline was rapid, and his mind was starting to falter. But Emily stayed by his side. As Emily sat by his bed one evening, Mr. Thomas surprised her. His eyes, once sharp with hatred, softened as he stared at her. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "for all of it." Emily froze. She had never expected this. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, but there was regret in his voice. A recognition of the choices he'd made, the lives he'd hurt, and the poison he'd spread. This moment was a turning point. The man who had spent his life building walls of hatred was now breaking down the walls inside himself. Emily knew that in that moment, he wasn't just apologizing to her. He was apologizing to a lifetime of people he had wronged. Take a second to reflect on this. Have you ever encountered someone who tried to make amends? even if they didn't fully understand the depth of their actions. It's a rare thing, right? When we're so set in our ways, it takes something monumental to shift our perspective. But Emily's patience, her compassion, was the catalyst for change. As Mr. Thomas's health deteriorated, Emily was there. She was the one to feed him when he could no longer feed himself, to comfort him when the pain became unbearable. She held his hand through the long, lonely hours of the night. His family was absent, too ashamed or too estranged to be there. But Emily was there. She wasn't there out of obligation. She was there because she understood that being human meant showing compassion, even in the hardest of circumstances. On his final night, Mr. Thomas's breathing became shallow. His body was frail, but his mind was clear. He reached out for Emily's hand. It was an action that stunned her. This man, who had once called her less than human, now reaching out to her in his final moments. With trembling hands, Emily took his hand in hers. She didn't need to say anything. Words were no longer necessary. As he squeezed her hand, she felt the weight of years of regret, pain, and unspoken apologies. For a brief moment, they shared something profound, something that transcended race, anger, and hatred. It was a moment of pure humanity. In that moment, as Emily held his hand, did Mr. Thomas finally see her? Did he see the person beyond the color of her skin? And what would this act of compassion mean for Emily moving forward? Mr. Thomas passed away shortly after that moment. Emily was with him, holding his hand until the very end. She had done what many people wouldn't. She had forgiven him, not for him, but for herself. She had offered him the most precious gift she could, her humanity. The world would never know the full depth of that moment. No one would write about it in the papers, and no one would give her a medal for the selflessness she showed. But Emily knew. She knew that, in that final moment, she had given something that went beyond race, beyond hate. She had given compassion to a man who had never thought he deserved it. Emily's life continued after Mr. Thomas's death, but she was different. That act of sacrifice, of holding his hand as he died, changed her. It opened her heart in ways she hadn't anticipated. She began to see the world differently, understanding that forgiveness wasn't about excusing someone's actions, but freeing yourself from the weight of anger. And as for Mr. Thomas, his legacy was no longer defined by his hate. In those final moments, Emily's compassion had redefined his story. So what's the takeaway from this powerful story? Sometimes the most profound acts of humanity come in the face of our deepest prejudices. It's easy to hold on to anger, to stay stuck in our biases and judgments. But true growth comes when we challenge those beliefs and show empathy, even when it's hard. Emily's journey reminds us that compassion has the power to heal, to transform, and to redeem, not just others, but ourselves. What would you have done if you were in Emily's shoes? Could you have forgiven someone who had hurt you so deeply? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, it's never too late to show compassion. It may just change a life, starting with your own. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And if you're ready for more stories that inspire reflection and compassion, stick around for our next video.